PR Weeks started an initiative with Google called Changemakers to talk about DE&I within PR agencies. And the initial intention was to honor the great work that is going on in furthering DE&I. So we put together a panel, a Changemakers Council, which was made up of clients from some of the biggest companies in the world. There are about 20 of them, and we're going to hear from 3 or 4 of them very shortly on a panel discussion. So we went through all of the submissions, and eventually the council decided it wasn't appropriate, really, to award any agency a changemaker status at this moment in time, because we're still at the stage where agencies are making progress, but they haven't really moved the agenda on. For example, the amount of diverse hires between 2021 and 2022 actually went down, which, if you think about the racial reckoning of 2020, the focus on that in business and society was quite disappointing. They identified still a lack of pay equity within PR agencies, a lack of equity in the type of vendors that agencies work with, and other issues like that. So eventually, the decision was made not to award anyone changemaker status. And we want to dig into that a little bit with a panel made up of some of our council members, including Brianna Lafleur, who's our partner at Google, and is going to lead this discussion. So, to join me, and if you want to find out more about this, by the way, there's lots of content on prweek.com. We did a podcast series with 5 interviews with some of the council members. There's features, there's data, there's analysis. So we want this to be not just an ongoing conversation, we want this to be an ongoing process that will hopefully lead to real change and real change makers. But to dig into this a bit more, I want to welcome on stage our panel. First up, we have the Director of US Public Affairs, Rosalind Patterson, who's Global Marketing and Communications Executive at Ionis Pharmaceuticals. We've got Kim Sample, who's President of the PR Council, which is the trade body for PR agencies, so she has a great overview of the agency sector and efforts being made. And our moderator, Brianna Lafleur, who's Strategy and Operations, Global Communications and Public Affairs at Google, and Brianna is going to moderate this conversation. And has Chanel arrived yet, or are we going to go? Okay, let's go with our 3 panelists. So please welcome them to the stage for this important conversation.
As Steve mentioned, the Changemakers program is something we kind of developed in partnership with PR as the Global Communications and Public Affairs team at Google. And it was really... Is this better? No? Yes? Should I hold it? Okay. As I was saying... I know, but this is great. As I was saying, we really came up with the idea for this program because we were looking at the agencies that we use as Google, and we use many for many different parts of the business. And we started thinking about the efforts that we were making very intentionally. I hear the echo, I'm sorry. We started thinking about the efforts that we were making very intentionally to ensure that the communications team that we have in-house reflects the communities that we serve, and we serve a very large global community. Thank you. Is this better? Wonderful. And so as we were looking at the diverse global community that we serve and the efforts that we were making in-house to really diversify our communications team, and to be clear, we are not done yet. There's a lot of work to do, but we've developed commitments, we've developed goals, we've made progress. I have had the pleasure of working at Google for 5 years now, and what the team looked like when I started and what it looks like now is very, very different, and that's incredibly intentional on the part of our leaders and also many of the comms professionals on the team who are pushing our leaders to make real change. But when we looked at our collection of agency partners, we weren't seeing the same commitments. We weren't seeing the same change, and so we wanted to really lock arms with these agencies and figure out how to make sure that the agencies that we intentionally choose to partner with also share and reflect the same DEI goals and values that we hold in very high regard as a communications team at Google. And so with that, Changemakers was born, but I did not have the privilege of sitting on the advisory council as the lovely woman next to me did. And so I would love to start by asking, what was it like? What was the conversation like as you were reviewing the submissions and came to this conclusion about the Changemakers?
The pure definition of what a change maker is. And I think that's where we level set with our conversation. And before I came in, I Googled it. Simply put, a change maker is someone who's taken creative action to solve a social problem. And we collectively felt, while there was a lot of work, a lot of tactics that were being deployed, there wasn't a lot of creative solutions that were sustainable, that would really move the needle and make a difference. We also felt as though a lot of the entries weren't authentic in terms of truly presenting themselves as change makers. And for a lot of us, we had a lot of questions as we looked at each of the leadership teams, the words that were on the paper, the actions overall, and a lot of it just didn't add up. So for us, as we got deeper and deeper in conversation, and there was a lot of conversation, we realized that this may be a bit premature.
I'm also curious as to kind of what you saw in the submissions that was maybe trending in the right direction. Were there things that you saw that indicated, okay, this is a start. We're moving, but we're not quite there yet? Because when you say premature, I think I know I agree, but I know that nothing hasn't happened. We just need to see more, and I'd love to know what you think that is.
Well, we saw some of the tactics that have been, that for the last couple of decades have been utilized across the industry, such as partnering with HBCUs. We saw some DEI officers in place. We also saw, which I thought was breaking away from the mode, a strategic partnership, some acquisitions that actually spoke to the idea of taking the idea of bringing in different voices. Okay.
Just repeat everything you just said.
Wow, this is different. Okay, so we did see a lot of tactics that have been done over the years that have made little to no difference, such as partnering with HBCUs. And I cannot say everything that I just said, but I will say there's been a lot of movement around ERGs. There's been a lot of DEI officers put in place, not necessarily all reporting to the CEO. We also saw, which I felt was really trending in the right direction, acquisitions and strategic partnerships, which checks a lot of different boxes if you think about it. So with that said, there also was, to me, across the board, except for maybe a few of the many submissions, a play on what diversity means in this industry. This industry is, I think the last number was 70%, white women or white people in total. I can't remember, it's a large number. And so a lot of the diversity centered around who is considered the majority within the agency world. And as a veteran agency person, I was an agency rat for 19 years before coming onto the dark side, the client side. I know that I was a part of those same type of efforts in the past, and it was jarring, actually, for me. It took me back to some pretty sad, dark places when I was in the agency world. So I believe I could say that it has to be a creative solution that is actually going to make a change and be sustainable. So,
Yeah, I think sustainability is key. I think there's a lot of good intention and a lot of misdirection, and I think something that we say internally all the time is we're never going to get it right 100% of the time, but we have to do something. We have to try. We have to have some momentum. And just doing one thing once doesn't solve the problem. And I think part of, when we talk about DE&I, we often center on we often center on the diversity piece of it. But equity and inclusion are also incredibly important, and without having those pieces, you lose that diversity element. And I've seen it at several of the agencies that I've worked at. I worked at many agencies for the first many years of my career, I think 7 or 8 years of my career, and I really couldn't wait to go in-house and get out of the agency world, if I'm being entirely honest, because the culture was not welcoming for me as a Black woman, especially as a Black woman working in PR and tech. And so I'd like to touch on well-being and culture for a second, because I think that's where the inclusion, the belonging piece that is so important to making this change comes into play. And I'd love to know, how do you think we need to shift the culture in these agencies? What do they need to start doing to be more inclusive?
because across every company, there is a unique culture. But I believe it's beyond culture. I believe it is institutional beliefs and behaviors that have been handed down and cemented into our larger society that are just brought inside. And when you're in a tight, high volume, high pressure situation, and as most agencies are, you default to what you know and what you've learned and what you understand and what you believe to be true. So from a culture perspective, I would argue that most people have incredible core principles or values, and that they have a North Star that they all follow, and they probably are living their values to some degree. But like I said, as people, we bring ourselves to work in those beliefs. And so that's what I believe a lot of the conversations have started to move to in terms of identifying what you bring to work, which are your biases, conscious or unconscious, and recognizing that they play into every decision you make, every judgment or prejudgment that you make about people on your team. When you're interviewing someone for a senior position, I've been told often that when I would get feedback from my colleagues when we were looking for a mid to senior level person, yeah, I just can't imagine myself having a beer with them or with her. Another example I can give in terms of just long storied history of how individuals are viewed. African American male, law degree, along with a journalism degree, was a journalist, worked for Amgen, worked for Tyco, worked for a number of large companies. The feedback I got was, he's so articulate. In my mind, I'm like, he's a journalist and a lawyer and he's a grown man. He should be pretty articulate. But with that said, there was this action to want to read and reread everything that he wrote and to try to heavily edit. So this shouldn't say happy. The word should be glad. So little microaggressions that continued throughout his experience was difficult for him. And I would say, as anyone in here of color, those microaggressions are real. They sting and they cut deep and they last long. So from a culture perspective, being an ally, finding allies, educating yourself, and no one's gonna get it right. I have biases and unconscious biases. We all do, and I think the first part is acknowledging that. Kim said this morning that she read an article about DEI fatigue. That hit me like a ton of bricks. I'm like, I'm tired. I'm fatigued. But that's kind of the point, which is this is not a nice to do. It is a business imperative. And for the companies and the agencies that get it right, they're going to be rewarded handsomely. And I mean, we probably all can point back into points in time in our life when you were just clicking and you were gelling. If you think about the type of people who were on your team, did they all look like you? And was it always comfortable? Were you always in sync and finishing each other's sentences? That's not going to breed creativity or innovation, right? So, yeah, I'll say that.
We have a few questions from the audience, so I think we can jump to maybe one or two of those. This first question says, is it fair to put the onus of DEI and PR on agencies? How can we also hold clients accountable? And I want to be clear, I don't think we're putting the whole onus of DE&I on just the agencies here, so I apologize if it comes off that way. But I think it's more about partnering to really move the industry forward as a whole. It's making sure that when we say we have these commitments, like share your commitments, tell us what you're doing. How can we do this together? Because we need you and you need us. Like this is a mutually beneficial relationship that we have entered into, and so it is extremely important that we're sharing the same goals and values so that we can do the best possible work that's going to benefit both of our businesses. It's really, I think, Kim, you said this when we were speaking previously, there's a real business imperative to this here.
Yeah, totally. And I think that opportunity, I thought like a great iteration of Changemakers for next year might be client and agency partnerships that have been real change makers, because I think both sides of the equation have to be working together. And clearly at agencies, we've got a lot to do. I've listened to these stories of these amazing, talented professionals who were doing this work in agencies 10 or 20 years ago, and it's hard to acknowledge that we have not progressed that much. I think many agencies are working very hard. I think one thing we've learned, and Changemakers really illuminated it, is, you know, when George Floyd was murdered, there were a lot of action steps demanded by different organizations like Hold the Press and 600 and Rising, and our organization tried to, you know, bring those together and, you know, push them out to agencies, and DEI experts were advising the same steps. But what we've really all learned is that that's a series of tactics, and unless you make DEI an overarching business strategy and treat it like a business strategy, put the time and money behind it, every single day, hold people accountable for delivering on that business strategy, we're not really going to get anywhere. And it's that overarching business strategy that will help us make the cultural changes rather than a series of action steps that we're just ticking off.
I definitely agree. One more question before we get back to mine. This one says, what strategies do you use to drive momentum? We've created a lot of thoughtful DE&I. Hi.
It's always the PR people making the entrance.
Welcome.
Fabulous one, too.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My apologies for being tardy. I came out from Lake County.
We're just answering a couple of audience questions, so maybe you can jump in on this one. What strategies do you use to drive momentum? We've created a lot of thoughtful DEI/J resources and programs to help companies along, but they're not doing the work.
So what strategies that we do? So I think that, first of all, I think it's a very important issue, and that one of the biggest things that we do at AbbVie is really work with intention and really figure out, like, literally, what are our gaps? What can we honestly close? And what are going to be beyond our ability to close? And then we have honest and frank conversations about what that means as far as results. Now, we in public relations, we all talk about results. We know what KPIs are, but what are real measurable KPIs that can show sustainable growth that we can build on? It's not like a flash in the pants, but it's like, is it recruiting? Is it retention? Is it culture? What are the barriers stopping us from retaining and maintaining our talent levels and being the employer of choice for people of color, for everyone, for talent, and for people of color?
Well said. Kim, I have one more question for you. Is just, how do you view the role of folks like yourself? How do you view the role of the white women in this industry that make up the majority of professionals that are doing this work? How do you view the role of the senior leaders who know that they need to do this but don't know where to start or don't know how?